It's one of the longest, toughest civil rights battles in our history, which involves half of the citizens of the nation. It's usually portrayed as women asked for the vote at Seneca Falls in 1848. Then it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and no one else was involved. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. And all of that is, of course, completely false.
African-American women are present, some of them very prominent women like Sojourner Truth. And those women speak to a different political philosophy because African-American women are the embodiment of both, if you will, blackness and womanhood.
There's millions of women involved in this, and men who supported suffrage for women. The constitutional amendment, what we call 19th Amendment, finally is passed by a very narrow margin, goes to the states for ratification. That's the crucial last step. 3/4 of the states in the Union have to approve this, and that means 36 states. And by the summer of 1920, 35 have ratified. They only need one more.
Well, Tennessee was out of session, so their governor, Albert Roberts, called the legislature back into special session in August of 1920.
The women and the men are wearing yellow roses to signify their support for ratification of the 19th Amendment. The opposition, the anti-suffragists, both men and women, are wearing red roses. It really meant they did not want equality for women, and they certainly did not want Black women to vote.
And this is not a secret. In 1919 and 1920, Black women threatened to tip the balance of political power.
And it does come down to a vote of conscience by the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24-year-old man named Harry Byrne.
Harry, this article says that you are the father of women's suffrage. What is that all about?
Well, that's the first time I've ever been so designated. It's the first time I've ever heard the words expressed in that particular manner.
Harry T. Byrne was my great-granduncle, leaves his home in Iota to go back to Nashville for this session, planning to vote for the amendment.
I had left Iota, my farm, and where my mother lived, going to Nashville planning to vote for women's suffrage. But after I got over there, my political advisors, the elderly statesmen in McMinn County, suggested we ought to let it go over.
He's worried about his re-election chances. So he starts to kind of side with the anti-suffragists. He's wearing a red rose.
He knows his constituents are not going to be happy. He knows his mentor is not going to be happy. And yet he changes his mind because that morning he has gotten a letter from his mother.
I think Feb Byrne has a fascinating story. She's a successful farm manager, and a lot of her farm hands, a lot of them couldn't even read. They were illiterate, yet they were voting, and she couldn't. So she writes the letter, and it arrives on the morning of August 18th. On page 2, she says, "Hoorah, vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt." And that's when Harry realizes, without me, this amendment's going to die. Tennessee's going to reject it. So I'm going to follow my conscience, follow my mother's advice. And he casts a yes vote on that roll call, making it 49-47, breaking the tie, and making Tennessee the perfect 36th state required to ratify this amendment.
Are you happy now?
Yes, I've been asked that question 10,000 times, and I've always been glad to answer yes. I've always been glad I did.
It didn't end in 1920. We can commemorate this wonderful anniversary, but it's not the end of the story.
Many American women can't vote after 1920. What Black women know is that no 19th Amendment will get to them to the polls if intimidation and violence continue to be the order of the day in the American South. We have voter ID requirements. We have the shuttering of polling places. We have the purging of voter rolls. All those things mean that once again, we're in an era of voter suppression that has the disproportionate effect of disenfranchising voters of color.
We have to realize that we're in another period where voting rights are threatened, where our democracy, the sort of foundation of our democracy, is threatened. So I think there are some really critical, important questions today that harken back to the suffrage movement and tell us that this fight is just never over.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.